Welcome to yet another YouTube video lecture. Number 7, George Washington's administration. So this is going to cover major points of Washington's 2 terms in office. A lot of other things will be covered later in class to kind of fill in some of the more important things. So let's go ahead and get started right away. George Washington, first president of these United States of America. Yeah, he deserves that. He had one of the interesting elections, the only man to be unanimously elected. That first election was kind of funny because, as I was talking about in class, it took a while to ratify the Constitution. So that first election actually began in mid-December of 1788, and they didn't actually finish the voting until the first week or so of January of 1789. It's the only election that ever takes place in actually 2 different years, 1788 and 1789. He took the oath of office April 30th, 1789, and becomes the first president of the United States. And everything he is going to do basically becomes a precedent. His vice president is John Adams. The Secretary of State is Thomas Jefferson, who we'll talk a lot about here in the coming weeks. Alexander Hamilton, who we're going to talk a lot about today as well. Very, very important, Secretary of the Treasury. And you remember this gentleman here, Henry Knox. This gentleman who helped bring cannon to Washington during the American Revolution, became a good personal friend of George's, and he has selected him to be Secretary of War. So what Washington winds up doing here is he winds up creating a cabinet. Now, nowhere in the Constitution does it say a president should have a cabinet, but it does talk about from time to time he should get the advice and consent of the executive departments. So Washington, being kind of what we'd call a loose constructionist, decided that went, well, I should create a cabinet of these advisors. And over the years, the cabinet would expand to many different other positions as well. One of the first big things that takes place during Washington's administration is this thing called the Judiciary Act of 1789. Now, the Constitution stated that there would be 3 branches of government, one of which would be a judicial branch. But it was very kind of vague as to what exactly would be the judicial branch. It did mandate that there had to be a Supreme Court. So one of the things that the Washington administration would help oversee was this creating of a national court system for us. Like I mentioned in class, there already were state courts. But now we're going to have a federal court system. And so one of the first major laws that this brand new Congress, under the brand new Constitution, gets involved in is creating this judiciary branch under the Judiciary Act. The Federalists, who are now becoming a political party slowly, they want a very strong national system, obviously, because they believe in strong government. So under this act, they wind up creating several different things. They create federal district courts in each state. So not only are there state courts, but there's now also federal courts. So if someone breaks a law that is more than just a state law, it's what we now call federal law, they'll be taken to federal district courts. But they also added a system of appeals. They added at this time period 3 circuit courts. So if you lose your case in a district court and you feel there's an issue of constitutionality that was violated, so you want to have another trial, you can now appeal to a circuit court level. And then on top of that would then become the Supreme Court, which would have final say on all matters. So this becomes one of the first major stepping stones in George Washington's first initial presidency. Now, this act also established that there'd be 6 justices. Today we have 9, but in this time period they would have 6. They convened only twice a year. They met only twice a year and for 2 weeks at a time. Pretty good gig. Well, not really, because a big issue is going to come out of this. I want you to look at this expression down here, road circuit. This will eventually become a major, major issue later on when Thomas Jefferson is president, and we're going to go back to this idea. What it means is that these 6 judges who sat on the Supreme Court, since they only met for 2 weeks, twice a year, so 4 weeks out of a 52-week calendar year, they would have to literally get on their horses and ride circuit. These 3 circuit courts. The same judges that will hear cases at the Supreme level will also hear cases at the circuit level. So throughout the year, they're sitting circuit. They're sitting at the circuit level courts, hearing cases, which is going to cause a huge problem, a conflict of interest. If I've sat at the circuit level and made a decision, but then someone appeals that to the Supreme Court, and I'm the same judge, see, that's going to cause some problems, and that's something we're going to get into later on in a few weeks. So I do want you to remember that these judges had to ride circuit and hear cases at both the district level, or at the circuit level, and then perhaps later on as well at the Supreme Court level. What I really want to talk about is the big thing in Washington's first term, and that's the development of an economic system and Hamilton's economic financial plan. Wait, no booze, no booze. Yes. Better. Now, Hamilton is a very controversial guy, and we're going to talk a lot about him in class. He's one of the writers of the Federalist Papers, as we talked about earlier. He's the Secretary of the Treasury. And what has happened is Congress, which is what Congress is supposed to do, by the way, they approach Hamilton as the Secretary of the Treasury, and they ask him to write a report on the state of the economy. And what does he do? Well, he writes a report. He actually winds up writing 3 major reports. The first report, now this is again at the request of Congress that he did it. He didn't do it on his own, but he's been asked to write a report. His first report analyzed the financial standing of the United States of America and made recommendations for the retirement of what is known as the national debt. During the American Revolution, the country under the Articles of Confederation acquired a very large debt. America borrowed a lot of money from other European countries, mostly the French as well as the Dutch. So they're in debt, but they also borrowed money from private citizens. So he acknowledges that there's a huge debt. He's commissioned to write this report in September of '89. He makes his official report in 1790. He says the debt is in 3 categories. Debt owed to foreign nations, debt owed by national government to private citizens, and there was also debt owed by states to private citizens. So the states were also in debt, but not all the states were in debt. Now he wrote this in a 140,000 word document. And you guys get so upset whenever I make you read just a 2-page document. What you gonna do when they come for you? Yeah, you don't like reading anything. Imagine reading a 140,000 word document. And that's what this was on the state of our financial affairs. Well, what does he want to do with this? Well, he calls for what he calls assumption. This is a hugely controversial issue. He wants to assume all the state debt into the national debt. In other words, make this debt, number 3 here, owed by the states, into these 2 debts here that the national government owes to foreign nations and to private citizens. Make it one debt. It's called an assumption. And this is going to anger a lot of Southerners, especially. Southerners who believe in states' rights, some of which were originally anti-federalist to begin with, and they're going to really try to stop this in Congress. They don't want to have anything to do with this. So there's going to have to be a major compromise. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a clue. and for those of you who are watching this and maybe are not in my classroom, sorry about this, but on class on this Monday, we're going to read a little something from Thomas Jefferson where he talks about having a special dinner date with Hamilton. And they're going to come to a compromise. In order to get assumption, which is what Hamilton wants, he wants assumption. Jefferson wants something for the South. And something's going to be agreed upon that's going to put something special in the South. And that's my little clue to you. Something gets moved and put in the South. I'm not going to tell you what it is. I'm going to make you have all kinds of anticipation over the weekend as you watch this. What could that possibly be? Well, I don't know. You probably really don't care. But in any ways, be thinking about that. And we'll talk about that on Monday. What is the compromise they come up with? Because, assumption, you might be wondering, why is this so controversial? Well, it's controversial because, again, the southern states are starting to become more and more states' rights. And they're afraid that if you allow the federal government to control all the debt, it's going to actually make the federal government more powerful. And the states will have to support this federal government because it's now in debt. And that's something that the Southerners just didn't want to do. But again, there's going to be a major compromise that's going to be thrown out there. Another thing that he calls for in his first report is a tariff. And I want you to become very, very familiarized with this word, tariff. This is a tax, but it's a special type of tax. It's a tax on imports, items coming into the United States of America. This, for a long time in our history, is going to be a major issue, the idea of tariffs. This is how the government will raise money. But it's also for another very important reason. Hamilton, this guy here, he believes in a manufacturing America, that America should start manufacturing its own goods. But in order to do that, you have to protect new industry in America from stronger industries in Europe, especially Great Britain. So the way you do that is you place this tax on their imported goods. That way you drive up the price of foreign goods. If there's a tax on British-made products, those products will be a little bit more expensive than American-made products. And so people would rather buy American then. So tariffs will serve two purposes. They'll both raise money, revenue for the government, but they'll also protect industry in America. So that's why he wants to put a tariff out there. In his second report before Congress, he comes up with yet another very controversial issue. Hamilton decides there needs to be an official bank of the United States. He models it on the Bank of England. He's very much he very much cares about the way England is. He believes that England has the best type of system. On many times he'll go on record of saying that they actually have the best form of government, which is why a lot of people dislike Hamilton. He seems like he's more and more pro-monarchy than he is a republic. But he just likes a lot of aspects of the British government. And one of them is this bank. And this is something we'll talk a lot about in class as well. Now every state already has a bank system. But this will be a bank for the United States. And this will be a bank that will oversee all other banks in the country. They're the ones that decide on establishing credit for the nation. They will regulate currency in America. We talked about this the other day. You have fiat paper money. You have commodity money, which is gold coins and silver coins. You are also going to have receipt money or representative money, money that we backed up on gold. So as states want to print paper money, this entity, the Bank of the United States, will control how much paper money they could actually print and will decide what you can back it up on and what you cannot back it up by. Again, this becomes an issue for southern states because they don't like someone telling them what to do. They want to be able to have their own bank system. Jefferson will never like this bank, and this will be the catalyst for him to create his own political party. The last thing that he talks about is he wants to create a federal excise tax. Tariffs are tax on imported goods. An excise tax is a tax on domestic products. And here in a few moments, you're going to see what happens here. He places a tax specifically on whiskey, which is going to lead to a major issue in America as well. All this is coming down to the idea of loose constructionism versus strict constructionism. How do you view the Constitution? When he came up with the idea of the bank, Jefferson immediately rejected this. He went to Washington and said, you cannot have a bank, because nowhere in the Constitution does it say there should be a Bank of America. Jefferson is strictly interpreting the Constitution. Hamilton counters with a loose interpretation. Article 1, which creates legislature, Article 1, Section 8, at the very end of that section states that Congress shall pass all laws they deem proper and necessary. And he will go on to write an essay for Washington where he will say that a Bank of the United States is proper and is necessary. It's going to regulate our economy. It's also going to establish credit for the nation. Washington listened to this argument. Jefferson also writes an essay. He listens to that argument. He actually liked both of them, but in the end he chose to go with the bank. So Washington, although never a Federalist, will join sides with the Federalists. Which leads us to this man, Thomas Jefferson, who always had a different vision of America. He didn't see America in the terms of finance and things like that. He saw America as something better. He saw America in the terms of an agrarian society. Yes, he saw America as this great nation of farmers. And he's going to oppose Hamilton. And what he's thinking that Hamilton is creating this manufacturing nation that's based more on an English model. One of the things he didn't like was Hamilton was non-elected. He was appointed to the Secretary of the Treasury. And yet he had so much control over Congress. This is really what Jefferson feared. In all honesty, sometimes people believe that Jefferson dislikes big government. And that's actually not true. Jefferson understood the need for government. Right? He had read the Federalist Papers. He had read the idea of if men were angels. We talked about that in class. He understands that you need a government to govern the governed as well as take care and govern itself. Jefferson believed in that. But he didn't like the idea of a massive government that can just do whatever it wants, and especially with someone who's only the Secretary of the Treasury, not elected by the people, and having so much power. He felt the Constitution should be interpreted literally, which again made him a strict constructionist. Again, nowhere in the Constitution is the word bank. So he is going to fight this. He's going to lose until he himself becomes president. And we'll talk about that obviously in a couple of weeks. Eventually, he and his friend James Madison will start meeting together, and they'll start talking about basically how much they dislike Hamilton. It's like, you dislike Hamilton? Yeah, I dislike Hamilton. So what they start to do is they start to talk to other people who dislike Hamilton as well, and eventually this creates the first political party, known as the Republican Party, but we call it the Jefferson's Republican Party, because that distinguishes it from today's Republican Party. It has no connection whatsoever with the modern Republican Party today. This is a unique party for this time period. And again, throughout lessons and class and some other videos we'll put up, we'll talk about exactly how this Republican Party develops and how it eventually changes into today's Democratic Party. All right, let's get back to Washington. All this is taking place during his presidency. And now we get into his second term of office, which he really didn't want to do. After his first term, he was kind of tired. There was too much bickering going on. He really didn't like being president. Thomas Jefferson has a hand in this, by the way. Thomas Jefferson kind of pleads with Washington to stay. He realizes that there are political parties forming, there are different interests are growing in America, And the one thing that kept America together was George Washington. So he asked him to stay on. And so Washington does run for another term and again wins unanimously. But foreign policy now starts to dominate everything in America. And one place in particular, and that's France. The French Revolution is taking place in 1789. Eventually, the king, Louis XVI, is actually going to lose his head. He and his wife Marie Antoinette will be beheaded by the French during the Revolution. This is going to cause problems for America from George Washington's presidency into John Adams' presidency, Thomas Jefferson's presidency, and it will eventually culminate with James Madison's presidency and America's first declared war, the War of 1812. So this is going to just be a major problem for America for a long time. The French Revolution and what comes out of that, this Napoleonic Wars that eventually come from this. The conservative Federalists never liked the French Revolution. Again, they saw this as a mobocracy. It's Jeffersonian Republicans who at first really appreciate the French Revolution because they saw it as an extension of the American Revolution. But eventually it gets way out of control. The Reign of Terror happens. In 1792, France declares war on Austria. Now there's war all over Europe. In 93, the Reign of Terror begins where they start to take everybody's head and just cut them off by the thousands with the guillotine. And France and Great Britain go to war. And this is going to be an ongoing war all the way through 1815 with the eventual deposing of Napoleon. What Washington decides to do is very controversial. There are a lot of people that want Washington to take sides in the war. They want him to take sides with the French. Remember, the French helped America in their revolution. So a lot of people felt that they owed it to the French. But America has no army. America has no navy. America is a new nation with very little finance. Washington waits until Congress is out of session, and Washington declares on his own neutrality. It's called the Neutrality Proclamation of 1793, that the United States will remain neutral in all wars with Europe. Why this is controversial, because again, we'll talk about this later in class, where in the Constitution does it talk about war? Well, there's two places. In Article 1, which creates Congress, it says that only Congress can declare war. But in Article 2, it says that the President is Commander-in-Chief of Armed Forces in war and peacetime. So a conflict comes. Does Washington have a right to declare neutrality, which is in essence your right not to declare war? Congress was out of session when he does this. This is why Washington is a really strong president. He doesn't worry about what Congress is going to say. They're going to be very angry with him, but he knows the right thing to do here. America's got to stay neutral. Now this French citizen comes to America at this time period, this Edmond Genet, and he is just trouble. He is just major trouble. He is trying to rise up armies in America. He's trying to get Americans to go over to France and help overthrow governments and help create this great French Republic. Washington asks him kindly to stop, but he won't do it. And this becomes an embarrassment to the Washington administration, this guy running all over the country, trying to get people all angry and upset. But in the end, because the French Revolution is so crazy, the people that Citizen Genet represents, they eventually all die in the Reign of Terror. So Citizen Genet has got to stay in America. He can't go back to France anyways. Also, a huge problem happening as far as policy is also domestic policy with the Indians. The Indians in Ohio go to war. The Great Northwestern Indian Wars take place in the 1790s. And they are secretively being armed by the British. And this is something that's really, really angering, obviously, the Americans. And this war will last nearly 4 years. And it culminates in the final battle known as the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, where America defeats the Indian armies. But what happens next is the Treaty of Greenville. That's what I really want you to know about this. The Treaty of Greenville, 1795. What happens, all those Indians that lived in Ohio and what is Indiana and Illinois, they officially give up all their rights to that land. So this is what happens. This is why this war is important. Any right that the Indian had to Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, they officially give it up. They're allowed to stay. The American government allows them to stay, to fish, to hunt, and they also promise to pay them, I forget how much money it is. It's several $1,000s a year as a kind of a sum to kind of say, hey, I'm sorry we took your land. They don't honor that, surprise, surprise, surprise. But this is what officially takes the land away from the Indians here in the Ohio River Valley after the Battle of Fallen Timbers. As I said, foreign policy is just dominating everything about the Washington administration, especially with Great Britain. Great Britain, as I said, they were secretively arming the Indians in the Indian Wars. They are also doing something, and I have this word all the way down here. As you see, I'm running my cursor over it, impressment. Impressment is something that happens on the high seas, on the ocean. British naval ships would stop American merchant ships, ships for trade. And they would board these American ships, and they would declare men who were on that merchant ship as runaway British sailors. And they would impress them or force them into the British Navy. Thousands of Americans are going to be either forced into the British Navy, or if they refuse to do it, they're going to be sent back home to England to live the rest of their lives in a dungeon. This is something that America cannot stop because they don't have a navy. America will send the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Jay. Here's our guy, John Jay, again. He goes to England to negotiate a treaty, Jay's Treaty. This is Jay right here, a painting of Jay. Unfortunately, before Jay ever got there, Alexander Hamilton sent agents of his own to England to let the English know everything that was going to happen. Hamilton did this because he didn't want to upset his trading. There's trade going on here. And he didn't want to have it stopped. Several issues. The British have forts still in America. They still have forts out here. That's how they're secretively arming the Indians. They promise they're going to evacuate all their posts in the frontier. They promise to do this. They also say they'll pay for damages of all the different ships that they seized. But they refused. They would not talk about impressment. They told Jay that he wasn't even allowed to mention the word, or about supplying Indians with guns. So he winds up getting a treaty with the English that turns out to be a joke of a treaty. It's a weak treaty. It means absolutely nothing. But at least they got some kind of a treaty with the British. The funny thing about it is it led to a really great treaty with the Spanish in Pinckney's Treaty, 1795. The Spanish had no idea what was going on here. They saw that the Americans were negotiating with the British, and they began to wonder to themselves, could they be going into an alliance with the British? That's what they thought. And they thought, well, if they go to some sort of a military alliance with the British, this could be bad for us. America wanted to travel the Mississippi River, but the Spanish wouldn't allow them. So under Pinckney's Treaty, they decided to go ahead and give America the right to travel the Mississippi River and the right to come into the port of New Orleans and do business. Very important treaty is the Pinckney's Treaty because it opens up trade, it opens up manufacturing in America and more opens to the West. trade up and down the Mississippi River. This is more money for you as a country. So this turned out to be a really, really good treaty. Jay's treaty, not so good, because it turned out to be a weak treaty. But at least they got something with the British. Which brings us to the Whiskey Rebellion. One of the last big things in Washington's administration. Remember earlier, we talked about Hamilton's report of the economy. And one of the things he said was that he wanted to put an excise tax. Well, they tax whiskey. And not just any whiskey. They tax whiskey of farmers out in western Pennsylvania. And not just any farmers, but Scotch-Irish farmers. Yeah, you got the picture. Scotch-Irish farmers are going to be taxed where they'd never been taxed before. Whiskey was always duty-free. So you made your whiskey, you sold your whiskey, 100% profit was yours. But you were selling it across state lines. And so the federal government said, we're going to tax this product. What this does, it proved two things. It proves that the federal government has the right to tax. The whiskey farmers started to scream, no taxation without representation, which is a stupid thing to say because you do have a government now. You are electing people to Congress. You've elected a president of the United States, so you are being represented. The government has a right to tax you. Also, they decided they weren't going to pay the tax. When federal marshals were sent in to collect the tax, the Scotch-Irish whiskey farmers of Pennsylvania tarred and feathered federal marshals. Washington, being angered over this, calls out for a volunteer army. Some 13,000 men show up. And Washington, as you see here in this painting on his horse, gets on his old general's uniform and marches with the head of this army into Pennsylvania, with Alexander Hamilton, here shown on this tinier horse, at his side. When the farmers saw this army coming, and they saw George Washington at the head of the army, the farmers quit. They gave up. The Whiskey Rebellion was not a major rebellion as far as any gun fire or anybody dying, but it was one of those big moments in history, though. It proved forever that the American government has a right to tax you. The government also has a right to use force when it wants to. So that is actually quite a big deal. But toward the end of this, Washington is tired. He no longer wants to be president. People have asked him to serve a third term. He's going to say, no, I appreciate all that, but I really don't want to do this. And he is going to step down. And so in 1796, there's going to be a whole different type of an election take place. With Washington gone, it's going to become an election of personalities is going to emerge. And two of the biggest personalities, John Adams, who's been the vice president for 8 years. John Adams, who was secretary to Great Britain under the Articles of Confederation, who was also the big voice behind the Declaration of Independence. He thinks it's his turn to be president. But so does Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State, also an ambassador to France during the Articles of Confederation Day, and the writer of the Declaration of Independence. These two men, over the next 8 years, are going to basically fight it out over the presidency. John Adams will win round 1. Thomas Jefferson will win round 2. Oops, sorry, spoiler alert. I probably should have said spoiler alert there first, huh? And that's something we'll talk about in the very next PowerPoint presentation. So again, this was just a very quick overview. Although quick, it does go 35 minutes. I apologize for that. And we'll see you next time. All right, enough of that. That's about to make me kill myself. All right, I'll see everybody on Monday.